Too many fantasy villains fail not because they're evil, but because they're not evil enough. I've been writing fantasy for over 25 years now, and I can tell you this. Trying to make every single villain relatable is the fastest way to drain all the tension from your story. So in this video, I'll show you why pure evil villains sometimes create stronger tension than complicated ones, how to write an evil presence that shapes your world without saying a single word, and when to stop making your villain understandable and start using them to push your hero to the edge. But before I get into the how, you first need to understand why pure evil still works. Think of your villain like a storm on the horizon. The worst kind isn't the one shouting threats at you. It's the one you cannot predict. There's no warning, no mercy. There's just pressure building until everything collapses. That's what pure evil does to a story. It's not meant to talk, it's meant to loom. When you treat evil as a person with motives, you invite logic into the equation. But once readers can debate with your villain, the fear softens. The storm turns into a guy with opinions, and tension leaks out like a slow puncture. But when evil becomes a force, an unstoppable presence, a silence that spreads, a rot that consumes, then readers don't want to understand it. They want to know if your hero can survive it. That's the big shift here. It stops being about arguments and becomes about what your hero can still hold on to when everything else is falling apart. That's why villains like the White Walkers in Game of Thrones work. They don't have speeches, they don't need a reason. Their silence is a threat. Because you're not scared of what they'll say, you're scared that they might never stop coming. So if that's the kind of pressure you want to build, let me show you how to design evil that doesn't need a voice to speak volumes. First, you start by removing the temptation to explain. Readers don't need to know your villain's childhood or their political manifesto. They need to feel the weight of their presence on the world itself. Think less dialogue, more impact. A village that went silent overnight. A forest where nothing grows anymore. A hero who stops sleeping because the dreams have turned on them. These aren't plot points, they're proof of impact. Pure evil changes the atmosphere, not just events. It pushes everything closer to collapse and forces your hero to act not because they disagree, but because if they don't, everything ends. That's the core of it here. This kind of evil isn't here to argue, it's here to test the hero's will to continue. Now, if you really want to make your villain feel like a force of nature instead of just a character, I've put together a free worksheet with prompts to help you show exactly how evil warps your world, your people, and your plot. You'll find the link in the description below. Moving on, building that kind of evil pressure I mentioned earlier is a great start, but it only works if the evil actually manifests on the page for real. And most writers miss the mark here, because they treat evil like it's just a costume. Think of the last time you read about a fantasy villain that was supposed to be terrifying, yet all they did was talk. Big speeches, big spells, maybe they burned a village just to prove they're serious. But instead of feeling dread, you felt nothing, because you weren't watching evil spread, you were watching someone announce it. That's a major mistake I so often see ruining villains. Too many writers treat evil like a job title, but what they forget is that fear doesn't come from what a villain says. It comes from what the world looks like because they exist. Compare that to how Diablo 4 does it. You're not introduced to Lilith through a speech. You meet her through the aftermath. People are broken in ways they don't understand. Villages are warping under her presence. Her evil isn't a plan, it's a contagion. A spreading influence that turns believers before it kills them. That's what most writers miss. Evil doesn't need to be loud, it needs to be visible. In the world, in the people, in the pressure your hero cannot escape. Instead of writing lines for your villain, ask what happens to people who've been near them too long. What habits change? What rules break? What do they stop talking about? So try this for a change. Write a scene where your villain never appears, but their influence still decides everything. That's where fear builds. Not from villain dialogue, but from environmental change. And once that atmosphere is built, your villain doesn't need to convince anyone they're dangerous. The world already believes it, and so does your reader. But even once you know how to write that kind of pressure, it still raises one critical question. When is this kind of villain actually the right choice? There's a pattern I call the mirror versus mountain problem, and it's the fastest way to know whether your villain should be pure evil or not. Some fantasy stories need a mirror. The villain reflects the hero's worst fears, twisted beliefs, or lost potential. But others need a mountain, a brutal, unyielding force the hero cannot reason with or outsmart. The villain isn't there to reflect anything, they are there to crush everything. And the story becomes not about understanding, but about enduring. Pure evil belongs in the mountain story. These are the stories where your hero isn't trying to win an argument, they are trying to survive something that feels impossible. A villain like this doesn't challenge beliefs. They force your hero to grow because there is no alternative. Think of Sauron in The Lord of the Rings. He's a burning eye on a tower, and still he defies the entire war. He doesn't have to appear in a scene to be terrifying. His evil spreads through corruption, control, and fear, and that's what makes him work. The story isn't about understanding Sauron, it's about proving that he can be resisted. This kind of villain becomes the weight that forces emotional movement. They make your hero ask, do I still believe in anything? That's what fuels the character's transformation. If your story is built on personal betrayal, conflicting ideologies, or a tragic fall from grace though, then pure evil won't land. It'll feel flat because your story needs reflection, not resistance. But even when a pure evil villain does fit the story, you still need to make them feel real on the page. And most writers blow that next part completely. When I first tried writing a pure evil villain, I thought the solution was to make them more intense. I gave them huge powers, made them cruel, I even had them do awful things early in the story so readers would take them seriously. And the draft still felt flat. Not because the villain wasn't strong, but because they didn't affect anyone. The characters didn't carry any fear between scenes, and the world didn't feel changed by the villain's presence. The villain just showed up, did something violent, and left. Then the story moved on like nothing had happened. That's when I realized the problem. A villain doesn't feel real just because they are dangerous. They feel real when the world reacts to them like they are dangerous. So I changed how I write them. Instead of asking what will the villain do next, I now started asking what has this villain already done that no one's recovered from? And how do we see that damage still lingering? That's where the fear comes from. We can see it in the behavior of the people around them. You know the villain matters when entire towns shut down before sunset, not by law but by habit, because people know what comes in the dark. Or when soldiers burn their own dead before retreating, not for honor but to stop something from rising. That's the difference so many writers miss. You don't need to humanize the villain, but you need to humanize the effect. So start by asking, what does this villain make your hero doubt? Not just am I strong enough, but does anything I do still matter? Is love even safe? Would giving up be easier? Let the villain cause friction even when they are not in the room. Make them a presence that scrapes against your character's belief system and doesn't let go even when they are not there. That's why to me the Reapers work in Mass Effect, for example. They don't try to convince anyone either. They don't explain their plan to be understood. You just arrive and entire species give up before the war even begins. Civilizations collapse under the pressure of knowing they are already too late. The fear doesn't come from what the Reapers say, it comes from what people stop believing once they show up. But if you haven't grabbed the worksheet yet, now's the time. These prompts will help you turn your villain's presence into real story tension. Because if your story's world is shifting around the villain's presence, if fear is reshaping daily life, then you've stopped writing a character, and instead you've written a force. That's what makes evil feel inescapable, not the battle scene. The choices people now treat as normal even when they shouldn't. But writing that kind of villain is only half the job. Because even the strongest villain won't matter if your story structure cannot hold them. But if your plot falls apart halfway through, or your villain shows up and nothing really changes, then the real problem isn't the villain, it's the outline. So watch this video here next where I'll show you how to plan a fantasy novel that actually supports such emotional pressure.